You guys ready to have some fun? Y'all are scared now because of what I've done recently. When I say fun, y'all aren't sure if it's going to be fun or not. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I think in our culture, we take light for granted a little. Like there's almost no place where we go where we don't have access to light. Except maybe a few weeks ago during the snowpocalypse, right? Some of you lost access to light, but not really. If your phone stayed charged, you still had access to light. I bet some of you guys had flashlights all over your house. Like very few of us would have to resort to actually lighting candles to figure out what was going on. Have you ever been in a space in your life where there was absolute, complete darkness and no access to light? It's almost out of our experience. It's almost out of our context. When I was a freshman in college, I graduated high school, and for a number of reasons, 2 weeks later, I was gone. And I went 15 hours away from home, from Colorado to Arkansas, and was cleaning dorm rooms, girls' dorm rooms, which, by the way, girls are nasty. I'm just saying. Was cleaning girls' dorm rooms on my college campus to survive that summer, and stayed with a football player in an apartment. And our little apartment was on the bottom floor. You walk in to a living room and you walk around and down a hallway, and down this long hallway was our bedroom. Inside the bedroom was a closet, a bathroom, and no windows, because of the other side of both of the inside walls were other apartments. And so when we would walk down that hallway and go into the bedroom and close the door, there was complete darkness. Like we called it the Bat Cave. It was before the days of cell phones. We could go in there and close the door and sleep for 14, 16 hours because no light would ever come in. What's our relationship with light? How do we even hear this when Jesus says, I am the light of the world? I think we take it a bit for granted. Israel had a thought process. They had a reference point with this. God was seen as the originator, the source of light for them. In their worship book, in Psalms, in their book where they used it to pray and encounter God, is also to worship collectively out of. It kind of just runs through this theme of God being light is present. Listen to a few of them. This one, Psalm 56, verse 13, it hits this before we read it. This is written when David was escaping the Philistines who were after him, trying to kill him. He says, "For you have delivered me from death and my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before God in the light of life." Psalm 37. An example of God's light coming to us and giving us a different way. It says, "Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him. He will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. Psalm 44, verse 3, when God's light is designated as providing victory for Israel. You know, when they went into Canaan and they took the land, it says, it was not by their sword that they won the land, nor did their arm bring them victory. It was your right hand, talking to God, your arm, the light of your face, for you have loved them. And then lastly, light being God himself. Psalm 27, verse 1. The Lord, and this is the name. How WG started this series. This is the holy name of God. This is Yahweh, the great I am, or as WG said, he is, because we ain't, right? The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? When I have him, I'm not walking in darkness. I don't have to wonder what's around the next corner. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? This was light was an important part of their tabernacle and then later their temple worship. In fact, when God delivered Israel and he was instructing Moses on how to set up their nation and instructing them in their worship, he gave them a very clear instruction of how to set up the temple. One of the primary elements of the temple was a lamp called a menorah. This is not a replica. It just kind of points to the temple menorah. The temple menorah, the lamp, was it told to be made out of pure gold. It stood over 5 feet tall, and had 7 lamps on it. 7 was a very important number that pointed toward God himself, this holy existence. They would light these 7 lamps every day from evening until morning. That's how they marked their day. During the dark time, light would come. The center lamp, the source from which light extended into Israel, was allowed to stay on all day long, because his light never left. When they would light it, it symbolized the source of their light. That God is the one who provides these things, the source of their wisdom that guides the light in their life. This was central and core to their understanding of God and their movement into worship. So when Jesus said, I am the light of the world, whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. They couldn't have heard these things without thinking about that 5-foot menorah, without thinking about their daily and weekly worship of God, without thinking about the context of their source of everything that is for them. But there's more. Like, this gets really good. You find this in John chapter 8. At the start of John chapter 7, we're told that the Feast of Tabernacles is going on. Like Jesus has gone to Jerusalem as the rest of Israel does, and they are coming to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's in this context that he moves to John chapter 8 in this declaration of himself. So what's going on with the Feast of Tabernacles? Okay, Feast of Tabernacles, it's a strange word, and it honestly has, I've come to think about it very differently than I used to. The Feast of Tabernacles is one of 3 primary pilgrimage festivals for Israel. While the temple was still there during Jesus' time, 3 times a year they would get up and travel to Jerusalem to celebrate these festivals. The first one was Passover. It occurred in March or April on our calendar, and it was the celebration of their deliverance by God from bondage in Egypt. Right? The Passover meal, the Passover angel of death. The second one happened in May, June on the calendar. It was the festival of Pentecost, which was basically the festival of thanking God for the wheat harvest that came in. The Festival of Tabernacles actually celebrated 2 different things. Big idea, the Festival of the Tabernacles celebrated the provision of God, God providing and taking care of them, Him being their sustainer. The first piece of the Tabernacles was God providing for their agricultural life. Like it was the culmination, it was the completion of their agricultural year, all of their crops coming in. And they celebrated the God who was blessing them with that stuff. It would be like for us today, marking a day at the end of our year and celebrating God for all of our paychecks. Like that's kind of the idea. The other piece of it was God being celebrated for his provision, him providing for Israel during the 40 years that they were wandering in the wilderness before they took the land of Canaan. They called it the Feast of Tabernacles because of what they did during this time. So a tabernacle, I used to think of as like a church building. Not what that means. A tabernacle means a temporary shelter. They would live in tabernacles for 7 days during this time. Tabernacles were built, the walls were built out of structural material, but the tops were they were covered with agricultural material. Like plants were put over the top for a roof. Farmers would build tabernacles when it was the harvest time. So you know farmers today that will go out and they'll get their machines and they'll turn on their lights and they'll work day and night while they're bringing in the crop, right? Kind of that way for them too. They would actually go out into the field and build this temporary structure and live there and eat there while they were working their crops until the crops were brought in. Then they would go back home. So they were right there in the fields. It's the same kind of structure that Israel lived in for 40 years while they traveled. They would take down the walls, they would put them on a pallet, they would put the grass tops on a pallet, and off they would go, and they would follow God where he would tell them to go next. They would get there and they would reconstruct their tabernacles, their little huts, and live there. So in the Feast of Tabernacles, while they're celebrating the agricultural harvest and the provision of God in the wilderness, they lived like those people lived. Now, I used to think about the Feast of Tabernacles as a solemn thing. I don't know why. I guess I didn't read very well. But I had in my mind, we got to leave our house. I got to go live in this hut out in, I have a confession to make. I love to be outside. I love to engage God in the world. I like to go to a deer lease and sit and watch. Not real big at killing stuff. I'm also not real big at, I prefer my bed rather than the ground. Like Kristen's thing with me, she was raised like a boy, and she's like, we never go camping. I'm like, was camping, buy me a big trailer I can sleep in. We'll go camping, right? So that's been my thing with this, thinking, this stinks. I've got to go live out on the ground for 7 days in a poor Jews. I'm glad I don't have to do that. That's not what this was. This was seen as the celebration of their year. It was party time. It was family vacation time. When they moved into the Feast of Tabernacles, everything that was part of the celebration was allowed. They could go shopping for food. They could clean and get ready for guests. They could invite guests to their tabernacle. They could travel to go see other people's tabernacle. The only things that were not allowed in the Feast of Tabernacles was anything that would take away from their celebration. Again, me and Kristen would have a thing there. Hey, babe, we can't go make fence right now. We're celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. Let's do that. I say that because I'm making fence all weekend. I'm tired. This festival, they would invite friends over. Take a look. They would typically feast. Their meals would be better during this time than maybe any other time of the year, because there's a party. You saw the first tabernacle. They would decorate and bring artwork into these little temporary places. They would light them up with their own menorahs. Go to the next one. They would light now see, that's a contemporary one. They're actually using electricity. But they would light them up at night. It was a huge time of celebration and party, remembering what God has done. And it was in this context, with Jesus actually standing in the temple courts, when he turned and he said, I'm the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will never walk in darkness, but you'll have the light of life. Now, you see what was happening in the temple courts. Inside the temple courts, there were 4 giant menorahs. Not these guys. There were 4 menorahs that stood 75 feet tall. And on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, Israel would descend onto the temple in the court, the outer section, for an illumination ceremony where they would light the 4 75-foot menorahs as a remembrance that when we were wandering in the wilderness, there was a cloud by day and there was a fire by night that would guide our way. And that fire was the presence and deliverance and provision of God. So Jesus was standing in those courts a few days after they lit those things in the middle of the festival, and he's like, yeah, that's me. That's me. What God has done for your ancestors in the past, I do even more for you right now. Of course, their response is, you're insane. Like, your testimony is not valid. You can't just declare by yourself that you're the light of God. And they quote Hebrew scripture. They're like, you need at least 2 witnesses for your testimony to be valid. And what they're talking about is Deuteronomy chapter 19. There's a law there, and it's actually about court law. It's if you need more than 1 witness to convict someone. You need the testimony of 2 people, because it can't be 1 for 1, my word against his. You need testimony of 2 people in order to convict someone. And if 2 people come and it's proven to be that they're not telling the truth, then whatever penalty they were trying to enact on the accused is given to the accuser. The one who bears false witness will be punished at that same level. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So with Jesus claiming for himself, I'm the light of the world, in their minds, that's false testimony. You claim to be the light of life. We're going to take the light of your life away. That's how that worked. Like, Jesus was in serious discussion here. And his response is interesting. You remember during the communion when I read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Light, the light that has always been, that is the light of life, was coming into the world, but the world didn't understand it, right? Like, John the baptizer testified to him. Jesus doesn't refer to his testimony. He doesn't need it. Instead, his response is, you judge by human standards. I judge by a different standard. In fact, I don't even come to judge you. John chapter 3 tells us Jesus didn't come to judge, but to save. And then he answers their question. He says in verse 17 and 18 of chapter 8, he says, in your law it's written that the testimony of two witnesses is true. I've got two witnesses, he says. I am one who testifies for myself. My other witness is the Father who sent me. So in this ceremony, in the court where the giant menorahs are, Jesus just says, my witness, that I'm the light of the world, my witness is the true light of the world. He testifies for me. We're good. And then he says, my other witness is the Father who sent me. And so they ask him, so where's your Father? I love his answer, but it's challenging and saddening at the same time. He says, you don't know me or my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. He's saying you're the people of Israel and you don't have the light of life because you don't know him. And that's why you're rejecting me. I sit on that for a second. They are the people of God that are in the midst of celebrating all of his provision and all of his wonder. They're honoring his laws. They're making pilgrimages to the temple. And they don't know the Father. They don't know the light that it is that they're worshiping. I can't help but think of another story when I hear this. I think of Saul in Acts chapter 9, who is a persecutor of the church, thinking he's honoring God by destroying these believers in Jesus. And the light of the world shows up. Like he's walking down the road and this light from heaven shines so bright, it knocks him to the ground and his eyes become blind. And the conversation goes like this. He says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And his response, because he doesn't know the light, he says, who are you, Lord? Like, I don't understand who you think I'm persecuting because I'm honoring God, so who are you? He says, I'm going to make you a servant and a witness. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light. From the power of Satan to God. And they will receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. And he stayed blind until Ananias came and put his hands on him, and his scales fall off his eyes, and he's immersed into Jesus. and later in his life, and in coaching and challenging and encouraging the Corinthian church, listen to Paul's words about these things. He says this. He says, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as servant for Jesus' sake. Now listen. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. It is his intention for his blinding light to make its home in you. But we have an enemy in this world that is intent on blinding our minds so that that doesn't happen. We have an enemy just like Israel did. The people who claim to know God and worship him actively, to blind their eyes of the one true light. So I ask you this morning, and I can't answer it for you, but I ask you, how would our enemy blind you from his light? Would he use distraction or your overbooked schedule? Would he use relationships that don't look like the light of Christ? Would he use political or social lies to get your heart festered? Would he use personal lies of telling you, you'll never make it, you're not good enough, you're just full of darkness? His intention is to fill you with the light of life. In 1 John says it this way. If we claim to have fellowship with him yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. But if we walk in light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of his Son, Jesus, purifies us from all sin. At the end of this conversation, Jesus says, when you lift me up on that day, you will know that what I testify to is true. Jesus says, the cross is my proving victory for them and for us. Let's do the work of removing the lies of our enemy and moving to the light of life. One last encouragement. This is just bonus, and we're done. It's so good. So at the end of our story, in Revelation chapter 21, when it's all done, in the new heaven, calm down. And the new heaven and the new earth are coming. And John's testimony says, I heard a great voice from heaven saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. There will no longer be tears or death or crying or pain, because the old order of things is gone. What he says there is God's dwelling place will come among people. The word there is tabernacle. God will make his tabernacle among people, and he will tabernacle with them. That's what it says. The light of life is come to make his home with you. And it's available right now. And he says on that day, there will be no need for the sun or the moon, because the light will come from God himself. Remember them lighting the court? Can you go to that, David? There'll be no need for 75-foot menorahs. We have that available right now. I want to invite you this week to remove the lies and pursue the light. We started last week a challenge, a red word challenge. You can take a picture every week. We're going to give you a new set of red words through this summer. Or you can find it on our social media. We'll remind you 3 times this week. Here's my encouragement to help you remove the lies and move to the light. Is read the red words. Read the words of the light of life. Spend 5 to 15 minutes at the first part of this week and just hang out in his words. And a couple days later, we'll come back and we'll remind you. And we want to point you to those same words again. But we want to ask you to move from here to here with them. To move from surface understanding and knowledge and move into belief. I want to ask you to pray through those words for 5 to 15 minutes. Like meditate. Let your spirit dwell on what the light is offering. And then a couple days later, we'll finish by bringing you back to those same words again. And ask you, what are you going to do about it? How will you now live in view of the light of life?